Getting new people every single week. This is great. New folks are coming in. Just waiting for the clock to strike noon so we can begin. Welcome to those of you who have joined us a few minutes early. We got about a few seconds till we're going to start. For those of you wondering why we have a hard start at noon, it's because this also goes out on our live stream. And so the live stream picks up exactly at noon. So I don't want to start before it goes live at noon. And I don't want there to be dead time once we do begin right at noon, which is coming up in just a couple seconds. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our fifth and final installation of our conversation about Honi the Circlemaker. It has been a really interesting journey over a period that will cover almost 1,000 years when we bring it to a conclusion today with looking at the story of the story of Honi and the Babylonian Talmud. Of course, if we add on to that the time since the Babylonian Talmud was put together and all the many generations of study of the Talmud since then, we're actually getting close to over 2,000 years of study of the story of Honi and the Circlemaker when we finally get there. So with that in mind, welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time. I apologize if you're joining us for the first time. This is the fifth and final installment of this conversation. However, the entire record of these conversations the last 4 weeks are available both at the temple's website, tveboca.org, as well as on our YouTube page, where these sessions are recorded and kept at least to some degree of perpetuity. Can't tell you how long it's going to be there, not the 70 years, as we'll get to in the story today. So with that in mind, I am going to begin the share of the slide deck and invite everyone, just a quick reminder of the derech eretz, or the etiquette that I like to try to keep in these conversations, which is I do ask everyone to stay on mute, unless, of course, you're contributing. But while you're just listening along and reading, it's best to be on mute. You have no idea how noisy your homes could be. And because Zoom blocks out other people's microphones, if your house is making noise, it's possible that others will not hear what we are talking about. So feel free, by the way, if you have a comment to make, to raise your hand, to use the hand raising function in Zoom, or to unmute and holler till I pay attention to you. This is not meant to be only me talking. It is meant to be a conversation. But also when we're walking through the text together, to keep our microphones on mute. Quick reminder that much of the scholarship that makes up this course was put together by Rabbi Dr. Aaron Pakin of blessed memory, who saw this as one of the 12 tremendous texts in a course that he taught at HUC, Hebrew Union College, where he was president, and also based on a paper that he wrote, Telling Retellings, Honi the Circlemaker, and the Development of Rabbinic Narrative Discourse. Translations come from Sfaria.org, unless otherwise noted. A quick reminder of the themes that we've been talking about. Who is Honi? What is Honi? Is he a martyr? Is he a prophet? Is he a magician? Is he a pious man? Is he a holy man? Is he a devout man? And as we'll learn today, maybe he was even a rabbi, depending on who you ask. We've looked at the development of the story of Honi over a period, as I said before, of multiple generations, starting with an iteration from Josephus, the quasi-historian of the Roman period. And we are going to return to some themes that only appeared in the Josephus story, in particular, the death of Honi, which we saw in the Josephus story, but we did not see in the later iterations, like in the Tosefta, the early rabbinic collection of comments that were not included in the Mishnah. Reminder, Tosefta literally means like the extras or the add-ons. The Mishnah, the first iteration of rabbinic law, of rabbinic description of Jewish life from around the year 200. Knowing that Tosefta and Mishnah come from the same generation, but as far as we can tell, the story of Honi, the version in the Tosefta, is probably earlier than the one in the Mishnah. We spent the last 2 weeks looking at the version of the story in the Jerusalem Talmud, probably from around the year 500 or so of the Common Era, which predates by a couple of centuries the Babylonian Talmud. And we're going to see today some of the themes of the migration and the developments of the Jewish community, moving its locus out of the land of Israel and into what Babylonia, but in general a diasporic or an exilic experience, and we'll see how the redactors of the Babylonian Talmud have a different relationship with places and people and things in the land of Israel, and do try to either universalize, which I think is the generous way of looking at it, or to strike out the setting of the story of Honi in the land of Israel, because we don't live there anymore. And as if you're the early Babylonian rabbis and you're trying to assert your authority and the importance of your community, one way you can do that is to get rid of the authority and the situation of those you're trying to wrestle it from, which would be the rabbis of the land of Israel. Having said all that, we shall begin. This, as far as we can say, is the quote-unquote authoritative version of the story of Honi. And I say that because the Babylonian Talmud is considered to be the most authoritative version of the Talmud. And as was so brilliantly described by Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz of blessed memory, that, and I use this metaphor a lot, some of you hear from me frequently, that the Talmud, and the Babylonian Talmud in particular, is the edifice in which that Judaism lives and inhabits. The Torah is the foundation upon which that edifice is built. But the edifice itself, the place that Judaism lives and breathes and dwells, is the Babylonian Talmud. And the Babylonian Talmud doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in conversation with the Jerusalem, sometimes called the Palestinian, or the Yerushalmi in Hebrew, and in conversation with the Mishnah, and in conversation with the Tosefta, and in conversation with some of the Midrashim, the contemporary rabbinic commentaries on the Hebrew Bible, and on text from the writings, and on text from the prophets, and of course, it all begins with text from Torah. But as the Babylonian Talmud becomes the authoritative version of the Talmud, the stories within them often become the authoritative versions of those stories. And by that I mean, if we're trying to understand the meaning of the story of Honi to a contemporary Jewish audience of any period, right? The medieval period, the late medieval period, the early modern period, our contemporary period, right? This is the version that we begin with. Now, as we know, the reason why Rabbi Pankin went through all the efforts of creating a longitudinal study of the story of Honi from Josephus to Tosefta to Mishnah to the Yerushalmi to the Bavli, the reason why he did that was to allow us to appreciate a deeper understanding of the version that we see in the Babylonian Talmud. How do I know where I am if I don't know where I've come from? And so by reading the story of Honi in the Babylonian Talmud in comparison and in contrast with the earlier versions, we develop a deeper understanding of what the Babylonian Talmud is trying to teach us. That's the big sort of epistemological thing. Why study this way? To get a better understanding. And so now we'll delve into what it says. As we've discussed before, the themes of the story, many of them go through in various places in various ways, but there are also differences in almost every place. Here we go. The Mishnah taught, right? We know that in the Mishnah, in Masechet Ta'anit, the Masechet about public fasts. Why were they talking about public fasts? Because there was a dearth of rain, which was often a reason to engage in a public fast. An incident occurred in which the people sent a message to Honi HaMe'agel, Honi the Circlemaker. Reminder for those of you who may have forgotten, or if this is your first time studying with us, you may be wondering, why are some of the words in bold and why are some of them not? That was a tool utilized by the aforementioned Rabbi Steinsaltz in his translation of the Talmud into English. The words in bold are the only words whose translation actually appear in the Talmudic text. The words that are not in bold are the words that he, as the translator, stuck in there to make it make sense. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Talmud, I'll let you know that it is incredibly terse. The rabbis only use the words that are necessary. Sometimes even pronouns are too much for them. And so there's a lot of need if you're doing a translation. First of all, what's brilliant about Rabbi Steinsaltz is that he did a translation from Talmudic into Hebrew, where he wrote it out in modern Hebrew, adding the same content so that a modern Hebrew speaker could understand the text. And then he followed that into the English translation as well. So if we were reading this in the original Hebrew or Aramaic, it would read like this: an incident which sent to Honi HaMe'agel. There's a lot missing. And so since Steinsaltz recognized that his job as a translator was to equip learners to understand the text, he wanted to equip us to actually understand it. So he added all of this implied information that only a Talmudic scholar would know, so that a more general audience could have much, much easier access to the text. This event is related in greater detail in the following baraita. What's a baraita? A baraita is a statement from the Mishnaic / Toseftic period, right? The first few centuries, that was not recorded in the Mishnah. It's often recorded in the Tosefta, and we know that there was a Tosefta about Honi because we read it together. The sages taught, once most of the month of Adar had passed, but rain had still not fallen. They sent this message to Honi HaMe'agel: pray and rain will fall. He prayed and no rain fell. He drew a circle in the dust, stood inside it, and in the manner of the prophet Habakkuk did, as it is stated, I will stand upon my watch and set myself upon the tower. And I will look out, and he, God, will say to me, and what shall I answer when I am reproved? A quote from Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 1. This verse is taken to mean that Habakkuk fashioned a kind of prison for himself where he sat. This is the story. We are in the month of Adar. It is leading up. We are now, by the way, different than we saw in earlier versions, not necessarily as close to Pesach as we might have been. If we're in the month of Adar, we are 4.5 months, not 6 months through the rainy season, but it still hasn't rained. And that's still a problem because there's only 6 weeks left or 4 weeks left or whatever it is until the second day of Pesach, when quote unquote the rainy season ends, when we go from praying Mashiv Ruach Morid Hagashem in the Gevurot to Morid Hatal. We go from praying for rain for praying for dew. But we're almost at the end of the season and it hasn't rained yet, which portends disaster for the community. There's drought. There will not be enough water to get through the dry season. And so Honi does this thing. He draws a circle around himself and he says, rain. But no rain fell. One interesting textual difference between this version and the earlier ones, trust me when I say that in the earlier iterations, the people spoke directly to Honi. They said, Honi, go talk to God. But for whatever reason, in the Babylonian text, they create an intermediary. They send a message to Honi. If I pull up for a moment, just for reference, the story of the Mishnah, second graph, a Mishnah relates an incident occurred which the people said to Honi HaMe'agel, praying and rain should fall. There's not much in the way of explanation as to why that makes this change, except we should note it. Honi then says before God, Ribono shel olam, Master of the universe, your children have turned their faces toward me, as I am like a member of your household. Therefore, I take an oath by your great name that I will not move from here until you have mercy upon your children and answer their prayers for rain. We have talked about this before. What's going on here? Honi is understood both by the community and by the Holy One to be in a situation and relationship to God that is similar to that of a father and his son, where the son can get away with things vis-a-vis his father that a regular child would not be able to do. We all love our children. and allow them to get away with things we wouldn't allow other people to get away with in our relationship, especially adult children. And then Honi does this thing where he takes out an oath that he would not move from the spot until God makes it to rain. As we discussed in the Yerushalmi, that's deeply problematic because that is not ordinarily an oath that can be kept, and for that he should be excommunicated. He isn't, because he actually keeps the oath, because he has this special relationship with God. So he calls out the oath to ask for rain, and rain begins to trickle down, only in small droplets, not a lot. His students say to him, "Rabbi, we have seen that you can perform great wonders, but this quantity of rain is not enough to ensure that we will not die. It appears to us that a small amount of rain is only falling to enable you to dissolve your oath, not nearly enough to save us." Right? It's like saying, we need some money. Please give me some money. I'll give you some money. Here's a nickel. Not even enough to make a phone call. It's no longer the 70s anymore. And I'm thinking of that great line, that great scene in A Paper Chase, when the professor gives the student and gives him a nickel and says, "Here, call your mother. You're not going to be a lawyer." That's about as generous as the rain was in this instance. Not enough to satisfy the community. However, there is something of note on this slide that jumps off the page as something new introduced by the Babylonian Talmud. Anybody want to gander a guess? Margaret, go ahead.
Well, it's about they have seen him already do great wonders.
Say that again.
It says the student says that they have already seen him perform great wonders. No?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So they know him to be a miracle worker. Good. Yeah. I'm not sure that's a difference from the earlier versions.
What you mean.
That's not so different from the earlier iteration. Let's see.
The dissolve for oath, maybe. I don't know.
Let's see. What did he say? I may have lost the. This is the Mishnah. I take an oath by your grain. Okay. So yeah, that's something that's new. That is something new. The stroking of the ego that the students give to Honi.
Is it also about dissolving his oath?
No, we saw that in the Yerushalmi, that they were wondering, like, did he just make it enough to get rid of the oath? And that wasn't sufficient.
Well,
there's a particular word. Gabby asked the question in the chat, is this because he's being referred to as a rabbi? Ding, 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 ding. 500 ports for Gabby Tabib on the chat. Exactly right. In all of the earlier iterations of the story, Honi is described with various names and various epithets, good and bad, but never before is he referred to as a rabbi. Which we're gonna continue to discuss, but speaks to the evolving mindset of the Jewish community as it makes its way to Babylonia. And what I would suggest is, on one level, that as the community makes its way from the land of Israel to Babylonia, the rabbis are asserting greater and greater and greater authority and expecting greater and greater and greater authority from within the Jewish community. And this is a way, I think, to underscore that, right? It's fun to read the same story over and over and over again and retellings of it from over various generations, knowing that the story itself all happened at the same time, right? It's not like the story that the Babylonian Talmud tells is a different story than the one that happened in the Yerushalmi, or a different one from the Mishnah, or a different one from the Tosefta, or the different one from Josephus, for example. What's different is the flavorings, the spices that the tellers use in that time to somehow make it theirs. By the time we get to Babylonia, it would be impossible to be a leader of the community with the respect that Honi has and not be a rabbi. But in earlier generations, that isn't the case. That isn't the case. Not to mention, it also puffs up all the other rabbis. Oh, we're like Honi. He can do that. Maybe we can too. Drawing them together. Honi says to God, I did not ask for this, right? And this is now the petulant child. I asked, how many of you have been parents where your kids ask you for something to drink and you pour that much into their cup? Well, you asked for milk. There's some milk. I did this 2 days ago to Layla. She didn't like it very much. That's all that was left. I poured it in her cup and I had to get some more. Right? But she got all impetulant. I asked for more a cup, not just a little bit. I did not ask for this, Honi says, but for rain to fill the cisterns, the ditches, the caves. And so God heard, and rain began to fall furiously until each and every drop was as big as the mouth of a barrel. And the sages estimated that no drop was less than a log in size, a good amount, right? We're beginning to see the introduction of other rabbinic phrases here, like a log, and this, like the sages, like it sounds now like the rabbis that you and I know in the way they're describing this text. It's the same story, but with little turns of phrase and details that are sounding more and more and more like what you and I know. His students said to him, Rabbi, we have seen that you can call on God to perform miracles and we will not die. But now it appears to us that the rain is falling only to destroy the world. It's a little too much for us. It's a little too much for us. Please turn it down. A little hot, a little fast, a little much. Honi again says before God, I did not ask for this harmful rain either. Honi and Goldilocks and the three bears of rain, apparently. But for rain of benevolence, of blessing and generosity. Subsequently, the rains fell in their standard manner until all of the people sought higher ground and ascended to the Temple Mounts due to the rain. Right? Remember, the authors don't live at the Temple Mount. If they're going to the Temple Mount, this story must have happened centuries ago, because the temple was destroyed in the year 70, and the Babylonian Talmud was redacted in the 500s, 600s, and 700s of BC, of the Common Era. It was half a millennium or more before this that this happened. So it's still happening all the way back then. They had to go up to the mount because there was so much rain. They said to him, Rabbi, just as you prayed that rain should fall, so too pray that they should stop. He said to them, this is the tradition that I received, that one does not pray over an excess of good. Right? And if you remember from our conversations a few weeks back, this was the halachic question, the rabbinic question that opened the story of Honi, which is, when is it appropriate to pray to demand rain? And when, if ever, is it appropriate to ask that rain stop? And the presumption is that in general, and Honi transmits this here, it is never appropriate to pray that rain should stop, because rain is by default a good. And we have in our tradition a fail-safe. We have a release valve that there will never actually be too much rain, which is the story of Noah. And the brit, the covenant that God made with the Jewish people, with all of humanity, frankly, that God would never make it rain so much as to do a complete destruction. And the rabbis know that. However, there is a difference between there being too much rain for us, our community, and our time, I think, and destroying the whole world with rain. A little destruction goes a long way. And protection from complete destruction isn't necessarily enough to protect us from little destruction. But I want to again point out, as we're talking about the timing, all of this, the seeming anachronism in this story. That residents of the city of Jerusalem during this the standing of the temple would refer to their teacher, their communal leader, their guide as rabbi. It seems to be anachronistic. Unless, of course, you adhere to the understanding of history of the rabbinic tradition, which suggests that all of this entire text was revealed to God by God to Moses at Sinai, passed down orally from Sinai all the way till the time the Talmud was redacted and had to be written down for fear of it being lost. And that the Pharisees were the rabbis who were talking about the oral tradition, and there were rabbis living all along. Which is why, for example, they would have said that Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses our rabbi, as he's often referred to in observant communities, was walking on the journey from Mitzrayim to Eretz Yisrael, from Egypt to Israel, wearing tefillin. Because, of course, your rabbi wears tefillin. Why wouldn't he? The law had been, he knew of the law. If you're a historian and you come at this from a secular historical approach, you would suggest that, it would seem odd historically that a character of this time period we referred to as rabbi, there really weren't rabbis back then. Honi continued. Nevertheless, Honi says, nevertheless, meaning even though we don't pray for an excess of good, nevertheless, bring me a bull. I will sacrifice it as a thanks offering and pray at the same time. Why a thank offering? What's Honi trying to do here? He's offering an offering of thanksgiving to God for what?
Stop the rain.
Well, not just the goal is to stop the rain. What is he showing his gratitude for?
Listening to him.
For the rains that have come. All right, thank you so much. We have enough now. It's like you're at an all-you-can-eat, and they keep bringing more courses. You got to ask for the bill, otherwise they're going to keep bringing you food. Okay, we're good. Gedug. Thank you, God. Right, and as rather than to be so presumptive as to just pray that the rain should stop, Honi tempers that by also making a thanks offering. Again, this beautiful anachronism of a rabbi kind of doing what the priest does. Who brings the thanks offerings? The priests do. Right? For those of you who have learned with me before, you know that we tend to think of the rabbinic tradition, among other things, one of its primary purposes is to offer an expression of the way to do Judaism that didn't invoke the sacrificial ritual, that created the medium of prayer worship to stand in for sacrificial worship. Priests do the sacrificial worship. Jews of the later period do the prayer worship. And Honi, as a rabbi, would have known that. But I just love that there's this wonderful anachronization of someone being called rabbi, living during the temple period, participating in a sacrificial ritual. They don't give me the knife anymore to do that. I just got to cut my own steak at dinner time. And I do offer it, although I'm more of a medium rare kind of a guy, so it's not the whole offering that you might get. I'm not a well done kind of a steak. So they bring him a bull for the thanks offering. He placed his two hands on its head and says before God, Ribono shel olam, your nation Israel, whom you brought out of Egypt, cannot bear either an excess of good or an excess of punishment. You grew angry with them and withheld the rain, and they are unable to bear it. You bestowed upon them too much good, and they are unable to bear it. May it be your will that the rain stop, and there therefore be relief for the world. Immediately the wind blew, the clouds dispersed, the sun shone, and everyone went out into the fields and gathered for themselves truffles and mushrooms that had sprouted in the strong rain. Does Honi pray for the rain to stop? Phyllis is shaking her head no. Phyllis, what does he pray for? Can you unmute yourself and share?
He prayed for the rain to come.
Well, he prayed for the rain to come. They asked him for the prayer, and he doesn't say, God, please turn it off.
He just says he's done kind of enough.
He implies, exactly. He uses inference and implication. God, you made it rain a lot. You made it not rain a lot, and you made it rain a lot. And it's not so good when it's too much. It's not so good when it's too little. It reminds me of one of the things. So when I was a junior in college, a friend of mine was living with Shabbat observant Jews. A lot of Shabbat observant Jews go to Boston University. They live in the dorm, they live on campus. And so my friend was roommates with a Shabbat observant Jew. And so every Friday evening and Saturday, there may be certain needs to turn on or turn off the lights in the room or do whatever. And as a Shabbat observant Jew, you can't do that, right? Now, unfortunately, Boston University doesn't allow students to add timers to the light switches in their rooms. That would be too much to ask. Now, there's nothing wrong with my friend Jason, who's Polish German, to turn the lights on and off. But a Shabbat observant Jew is not allowed to make a direct request, right? The roommate could not walk in and say, Jason, will you turn the lights on for me, please? That's against Shabbat. Because he would need to find a way to compensate him for doing the malacha, for doing the work, and even as a non-Jewish person in the space, that isn't allowed. So what his roommate would come in and say, man, it's dark in here. And that is the limit of the language for someone who wants to invoke someone who isn't observant or isn't bound to be observant in that case to do this. So Honi kind of uses that similar language to God. God, didn't rain before, wasn't so good for us. Raining a lot now, not so good for us. Because as we see, it would be too on the nose for Honi to say, please turn off the rain. That you can't do. And what's interesting is the development of the rabbinic reasoning from, for example, the Yerushalmi from a little bit earlier, at least how quick I can find it. Here we go. This is the Yerushalmi. He's going to come in. They asked him, who are you? Rain started to drip. More rain. They went up. They couldn't stand it. Brought children to us. Kind of used the same reasoning, right? He brings the bull offering. They couldn't stand it. Couldn't stand it. Oh no! May it be your pleasure to bring relief. Pretty directive in that case. And here, may it be your will that the rain stop. Right? But what's interesting is even in that, it's not saying I want it to stop. He's still leaving one level of degree. God, if it should be your will to make it stop, we wouldn't complain. We wouldn't complain. Now, a few other changes in this particular part of the story from earlier iterations. So one is where they are in the Yerushalmi, they go out into the wilderness. Here they go into the fields. And here it adds two different types of foods, truffles and mushrooms. Okay. And although it mentions the Temple Mount, it does a little bit less so in this version than it does in earlier ones. they're moving away from the Temple Mount as being an important place in this particular story. So I'm flipping through this way. They're moving away because for the Babylonian community, the Temple Mount is a less important place for their own community. It was important, and it may again be important, but right now, when they're trying to establish the primacy of the Babylonian community for the diaspora, the Temple Mount has less importance in that relative place. And now we have the story, a part of the story of the dialogue between the various authorities. Shimon ben Shetach relays to Honi HaGel, if you weren't Honi, I would have decreed ostracism upon you. I would have excommunicated you. Remember why? Because Honi took a vow for a thing he couldn't ask for the rains to come. For were these years like the years of Elijah, when the keys of rain were entrusted into Elijah's hand, and he swore it would not rain, wouldn't the name of heaven be desecrated by your oath not to leave the circle till it was rained? Once you have pronounced this oath, either yours or Elijah's must be falsified. So this is a little cryptic, but a little background. Elijah also played with rain and with God in different ways than Honi. But one of the things that it says, one of the authorities that God has is to make it rain. God is the ultimate decider as to whether or not it rained, the tradition suggests. And so, in this particular instance, along with things like life and death, it seems unusual that God would abdicate rain-making authority in this case. But he did. But God did. Kind of like with Elijah. But already we're distinguishing because Elijah was talking to, and Honi doesn't do anything wrong. Honi does what he is allowed to do, which is why Shimon ben Shetach has to say, I can't put you into ostracism. I can't put you into cherem, excommunicate you because, well, God made it be that your oath came true. Lucky you. However, what I can do to you, as you nag God and God does your bidding, like a son who nags his father and his father does his bidding. And as the son says to the father, Father, take me to be bathed in hot water, wash me in cold water, give me nuts, almonds, peaches, and pomegranates. And the father gives to him. About you, the verse states, your father and mother will be glad, and she who bore you will rejoice. Right? We've seen this verse referred to in the Tosefta, in the Mishnah, in the Yerushalmi as well. There's something about Honi that puts him in this unique case of the way in which God refers to him and relates to him that separates him from almost everybody else. Which, of course, is why the people went to him in the first place. Yeah, Margaret.
Okay, so I've been interpreting a lot where it talks about your father and mother and who bore you as God. And here we're seeing she who bore you will rejoice. So could you elaborate on interpreting that, please?
Sure. And this is on one foot. What I think the primary objective, I think, of this citation is to describe how and why Honi is different from everybody else, and to ground that understanding in something in text. And by text, I mean Hebrew Bible text. And so this verse, your father and mother will be glad, and she who bore you will rejoice, is a way to show the level to which, right? This is a metaphor. Honi, God is your father. God likes it when you do these things in ways that if you were doing it to anyone else, they probably wouldn't, right? When other children do things, parents find it annoying. When their children do it, they find it endearing, right? So there's a piece of that as well. The gender piece of it is a little complicated, and yet we also know that there are feminine aspects of God, right? Shekhinah and all of that. And that seems to be, I think, a pretty accessible on one foot way to understand that particular verse. I want to look back real quick and see if there's anything else in the earlier iterations that that use that verse as a way to describe it. So, for example, in the Yerushalmi here on this page, it says, why does it use this verse? Why does it say the one who bore you? And Rabbi Mana says to your nation, meaning your nation. What I actually want to do real quick, Margaret, since we're looking at it, is pull up two things while we're looking. I'm going to pull up first the text from Proverbs to see what gender is in that text, if anything, and then see how it looks in the Aramaic, because I'm doing this work in translation already. So in Proverbs, it says, hang on. Yismach avicha v'imecha v'tagel, your father and mother v'togel yuladatecha. Yeah, so it's definitely a feminine. It's definitely a feminine form in the Proverbs. And what I love about Sepharia is you can look up those Talmudic references really easily, like in Ta'anit 23. Hang on. Ta'anit 23a.
And
it's just citing the verse.
didn't you also say that they don't use a lot of pronouns?
They don't. They don't. But when it does cite the entire verse from Proverbs in its entirety, and there is actually not a pronoun in the verse from Proverbs. There is no pronoun. So when it says, hang on, when it says she who bore you, the she does not actually exist there. It just says togel yuladatecha, because it uses a third person feminine singular form of the verb to bear, to bore. The only way to understand that is she. In the absence of the name of a particular female person, woman who would have done the bearing, but you imply that it's female because it's in the female form of the verb in Hebrew. And so as it gets translated, she who bore you, as opposed to, for example, the translation that we saw in the Yerushalmi, which says the one who bore you. See how it says the one who bore you there?
Yes.
I would suggest that the translation here by Steinsaltz is more precise, because the language because the verse from Proverbs is in the feminine form, you can't even hide behind the fact that Hebrew is a patriarchal male-dominant language, and a male form could really kind of apply to both, especially if it's in the plural. But if you have a singular third-person female form of the verb, as we have togel, it can only mean she.
So does that mean that it's like the Shekhinah, like it's the essence of the Creator? That type of thing?
So I think we can have a whole class on this, right? Which is like understanding the Proverbs, right? Which are themselves written poetically and written sometimes tersely. And then why did the rabbis choose to invoke that verse in this particular place? Right? We see the lead up, right? It's about father-son, right? Honi, you're like the son of a father who does this. And honestly, I think that the rabbis weren't concerned about this, right? We know that in this case, the entire parentage of the verse of Proverbs is God. That's the parent that we're talking about in this case, who is glad and rejoices on your having been born. Go back real quick to see.
Thank you.
What's in the Mishnah? It's a great question, though. Right, the Mishnah says, "Let her who bore you," in this translation, makes a lot more sense. Yeah. So there really just isn't that much time spent on that particular question, because it's God. All right. Moving forward, the sages taught, what message did the members of the chamber of the hewn stone, the great Sanhedrin, send to Honi the Circlemaker? What did the rabbinic leadership of the time say to him? Well, that he shall decree a matter, and it shall be established for you, and the light shall shine upon your ways. Right? That Honi was blessed by having these abilities. When they cast down, you will say, there is lifting up, he saves the humble person. He will deliver the one who is not innocent, and he will deliver through the cleanliness of your hands. These verses from Job that were also cited by the Yerushalmi. Honi's got something special going on, the rabbis seem to say. When they interpret this idea of you shall decree a matter, you, Honi, decree from below. You tell from below what God should do. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the master one of the universe, the Holy One of Blessing, fulfills your statement from above. And the light shall shine upon your ways. A generation that was in darkness, you have illuminated with your prayer. Honi, you have the ability to change the world from below. God, somehow you and God are in sync. You ask from below and God does from above. When they cast down, you will say there is lifting up. A generation that was cast down, you will lift up with your prayer. For he saves the humble person. A generation that was humble in his transgression, you save through your prayer. The people see themselves, the Talmud sees these people as having done something wrong, which is why there's a drought in the first place. And Honi has the ability to see through that and to save them. A generation that was not innocent, you delivered through your prayer, brought them out to deliverance. You brought them out of the punishment. And he will be delivered to the cleanliness of your hands. You delivered an undeserving generation through the clean work of your hands, meaning you brought water when there was none. That's the evidence of the deliverance. Fixing the problem. And that, up until now, was the end of the Honi story. That's where the story ended in the Tosefta. That's where it ended in the Mishnah. It's where it ended in the Yerushalmi. Now, in the Yerushalmi, there was that earlier digression and the story of Honi's grandfather from 70 years previous. And in the Josephus story, there was the later part where he got killed because of the infighting in the Roman community. However, the Babylonian rabbis find it fit for the story to continue and may be an even more interesting part of the story. The Gemara relates another story about Honi HaMe'agel. Rabbi Yochanan said, all the days of the life of that righteous man, Honi, he was distressed over the meaning of this verse. Shir hamalot b'shuv Adonai et shivat Zion hayinu kechol. A song of ascents. When the Lord brought back those who returned to Zion, we were like those who were dreaming. What does this verse mean? Honi is said by the Talmud to have wondered about his entire life. He said, is there really a person who can sleep and dream for 70 years? How is it possible to compare the 70-year exile in Babylonia to a dream? What's going on here? Well, it was about 70 years from the destruction of the first temple till the end of the exile and the reestablishment. Ironically, or maybe not so ironically, the Babylonian Talmud is written where? Collected where? In Babylonia. Where did the Jewish people spend those 70 years that he's referring to? In Babylonia. Back to that same community under very, very different circumstances. And he's wondering aloud, what did it mean? What could we possibly understand it to mean? Kacholmim, that we were dreaming or in a dream state when we returned to Zion, we were like those who dream. Now, I will offer that in our own era, there's that wonderful book called Like Dreamers by Yossi Klein Halevi, who talks about the return to Zion, the return to the city of Jerusalem. He tells the story of the unit of paratroopers that liberated the old city during the 6-Day War. And he calls his book Kahomim as a reference to this verse. But I think a lot of people rightfully understand it to mean that like our dreams will come true. Our dreams finally came true, that after 2,000 years, not just 70, but after 2,000 years, we returned. But remember, the story of Honi is situated during the time of the Second Temple. And even though the rabbis of the Babylonian Talmud are writing 500, 600, 700 years after that, they have to think like a Temple Mount era person, a Second Temple era person. So what would those verses from Psalms about the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, how would they have resonated with someone of the Second Temple? And we saw the story both in the Yerushalmi and now here in the Bavli, that it's like, not that we were dreaming the whole end to come back, but that like the period that passed from the exile to the return, we slept through it. How could you sleep for 70 years? How could you compare a 70-year exile to a dream? So they tell this story. One day, he was walking down the road, Honi of the Second Temple period, walking down the road when he saw a man planting a carob tree. Honi said to him, "This tree, how many years does it take for a carob tree to bear fruit?" And the man says, "It will not produce fruit until 70 years have passed." And Honi said to him, "It is obvious to you that you will live 70 years. Do you think you're going to get any benefit from this tree? Of course not." And the man said to him, "That me, myself, I found a world full of carob trees." And then one of my favorite verses, one of my favorite teachings from all of the Gemara says, "Ki hechi deshaltlu li ahavtani, shatali nami levari." Just as my ancestors planted for me, I too am planting for my descendants. That man recognized that the only way that he had the benefit of carob trees is because earlier generations people planted carob trees, knowing they would not get to enjoy the fruit that it would bear, but it would be passed on. It got paid forward. There's a poem that I was exposed to as a child called The Bridge Builder, about an old man who comes to a chasm and decides to build a bridge across that chasm. And a young man comes up and says, "Man, what are you doing? You're going to die soon. You're old. You're not going to build a bridge. What are you going to get a benefit? I'm not building it for me. I'm building it for the next guy." And our community, Bethel, also loves this phrase, because for those of you who have been to our preschool campus, our Beck Family campus in West Boca, inscribed on the wall, over the donor wall, over the names of all of the, frankly, older people who gave money to help build a preschool, what words are written on that wall? Just as my ancestors planted for me, I too am planting for my descendants. This notion that we in the Jewish community, not only Kol Israel Aravim, we not only take care of ourselves in every generation, but we take care of intergenerationally as well. We invest in the future for our people. Ironically, the carob makes for an interesting fruit for this story. It obviously meets with the motif of the 70 years because it takes that long for it to bear fruit. And if you want to have a path of a story of man who has to pass 70 years in a dream, a carob tree is a real reason to do that. But carob was not considered to be a particularly highfalutin food at the time. Carob, as I learned, was reserved for swine and other animals. It was like you only ate it if you really, 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 really had to. It was considered to be like emergency food, like rations. You'd only eat it if there was nothing else to eat around. Now, if you're in a world where you just had a flood or you're in the middle of a drought, actually eating carob might be something that you would do. But ironically, the carob tree is beautiful and the food is not. There are allusions in certain texts to suggest that the carob was the tree in the garden, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. In the Tosefta, it's referred to as a tree that people would worship in violation of God's law. For those of you, by the way, who are studying Parshat Shoftim this week and looked at the first chapter, in that first chapter it says you should not have a tree that you worship. The carob tree was often that tree because it was visually beautiful. Any of you familiar with the story of the prodigal son in the book of Luke? Also ate from the carob tree. It is not a tree that we often ate from. And etymologically, it's tied to disaster as well. The word carob, haruv, is tied to the word horban, destruction, and churva, desolation. It is not a happy, fun fruit. It is a sad that I have to eat it fruit. Bad things are happening if I'm eating it fruit. It is often talked about in the context of disobedience, of suffering, of poverty, of hunger, of death, and destruction. It is not the thing that the rich folks would eat. Having said all that, Honi, having told the man he's stupid for planting the tree, sits down, has a meal, goes shluffy. He sleeps for 70 years. A cliff formed around him. He disappeared from sight for 70 years. When he awokes, he sees a certain man gathering carob from the tree. And Honi says, "Are you the man who planted this tree?" The man says, "No, I'm that man's son. I have inherited from my father what he planted for me." And Honi says, "Oh, I must have fallen asleep for 70 years. And indeed, he saw that his donkey, who was with him the whole time apparently, had sired several herds during all those years. He's schluffing and the donkey is off siring. Good for the donkey." Honi went back to his house and said to the members who were living in his home, "Is the son of Honi HaMe'agel here alive?" And they said, No, he's passed away. But his son's son is alive, his grandson. And he says, "I'm Honi." And they don't believe him. He goes to the Beit Midrash and he hears the story. The sages talk about a scholar, the halakha, there was enlightening as clear as the years of Honi HaMe'agel. For when Honi HaMe'agel would enter the study hall, he would resolve for the sages any difficulty they had. And Honi said, "It's me. I'm back. It's me. It's Honi." And they didn't believe him and they didn't pay him proper respect. Honi became very upset, prayed for mercy, and died. And so Rabbah says this is why they say either friendship or death. One who has no friends is better off dead. Honi dies a different death than the one we see in Josephus. He dies because he isn't given the proper respect that he deserves. And Honi's death is also understood to be an implication of the death. Because where was Honi from? The land of Israel. His death in the Talmud represents the death of that generation or those generations. The death of the Palestinian community, the Eretz Israeli community of the time. And so just on one foot, a few things that we see come out in the story in the Babylonian. One is the rabbinization of Honi, calling him a rabbi, talking to him like a rabbi, taking the story away from the land of Israel, and the reintroduction of that 70-year sleep in a very, very different way. And big picture, and we got about a minute and a half when this is done, the big goal of the longitudinal look at this is to show that over time, the various redactors were pulled in two ways. They certainly wanted to be faithful to some of the themes and leitmotifs of the story. But there was a lot of changes to the story along the way, that they saw the freedom to change, to meet and make their own priorities. If we ask ourselves what Josephus was trying to teach us, that will be a different answer than the Toseftists, the Mishnaic authors, the rabbis of the Yerushalmi, and the rabbis of the Bavli. Because that's what we do. We take the earlier stories, we take their plot points, we recontextualize, because in every generation we learn new things. Just a quick final thought. Over the weekend, we had our parent learning program called Biachad. It's our alternative to Sunday school, where parents and kids learn together. And we were talking about the instruction, Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam. The study of Torah is equal to them all. And I taught the parents a way to study Torah with your kids, which is when you're learning, ask them 3 questions. What does the text say? What is it trying to teach us? And what do we learn from it? In some ways, the story of Honi, what does the text say, is a little bit the same all the way through. But what the authors are trying to teach us and what we learn from each one differs greatly. We are at time, but I'll take time for a few questions for those who might have. David.
The point that you I think her name was Margaret, brought up about she, and that's actually explained in today's Daf Yomi.
Oh, really?
Well, yes, very well by Safaria. And they go on to explain how one word, if it's written with 2 M's, is, masculine, plural, and with 1 M, it's a feminine plural. So yeah, it's incredible.
I'll look at that, but the particular verse that we see in Proverbs is unequivocally female.
Right. Yes, my point is that you are absolutely correct on that, and this is a backup point to it because it's explained by Safaria within Kettlebell 52.
Okay, I'll take a look and see. Thank you. Other questions before we wrap up? And I offer my gratitude to everyone for joining us.
Can I ask David a question?
Sure.
Well, you're in Las Vegas. You live in Las Vegas?
Yes.
I have a son who lives there. I come there. I'm going there in November.
Come and visit.
Send me your email.
I will.
You guys can chat each other, or I have them both. I can connect you.
Yes, please do.
Okay. Do you have people's emails?
David and I happen to exchange some, and I have yours, Margaret. So yeah, I do.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to thank everybody and wish you all a wonderful day. For those who would ask for the slides, I will send them to you. For those who are interested in having them, I'll put my email in the chat one more time, and you can take them down. But I wanted to wait until we finish before I sent them out. So anyone who wishes for the resources, happy to share them with you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.